Chapter 11. I know it's going to work this time. I just know it! You said that the last 3 times, yet I distinctly remember extinguishing multiple fires and plucking shards of glass and arcane crystal out of my cloak and mask after each of those attempts. Look, the orb's not going to explode this time. We've done the calculations. We've got the best materials. It's going to work. I promise. Besides, you're my magic mentor. You're supposed to be encouraging me. Well, at least you are unlikely to set fire to the surrounding flora from this spot. Hey, I said I was sorry about that. Plus, launching a Ragnarok spell just outside your family's cabin was your sister's idea. And therein lies your error. You went along with one of Matilda's schemes without a second thought as to the collateral damage her plans often lead to. Might have been nice to know that before going to meet your family. Well, consider yourself officially warned for any future plots Matilda may attempt to entangle you in. Oh, does this mean I'm going to be invited again? Not if you continue to prattle off topic and waste my time. Now, the spell. Yeah, all right, here goes. Sylvain took a steadying breath and pointed the arrow of Indra at the small glass orb sitting innocently on one of the many reddish rocks situated several yards away from the 2 men. Hubert hovered behind Sylvain, his eyes darting between the glass orb and the paladin preparing to cast. Hubert was garbed in the protective coat and beaked mask most commonly associated with dark magic users. Seeing as dark magic relied on manipulation of toxins, acid, rot, and other pollutants, protective clothing was essential for those starting out in that particular branch of magic, lest the spell backfire and its caster wind up with their face doused in corrosive sludge, or their lungs being choked by poisonous fumes. Hubert had been a practitioner of dark magic long enough that such protective gear was unnecessary, and often served more as a hindrance in battle, with its heavy layers weighing him down, and the mask limiting his peripheral vision. Casting Toxosis was a danger with or without the protective clothing, an affliction bypassing protective layers and seeping directly into the caster's pool of magic and inflicting internal injuries. And Hubert had not a spell backfire on him in years. Aside from using the attire in the occasional espionage mission, the standard Dark Bishop uniform had sat untouched and collecting dust in the back of Hubert's wardrobe. That said, the protective gear was perfect for testing out newly invented, unpredictable magical apparatus that were likely to explode in his face. Due to the volatile nature of the untested orbs, the 2 had elected to experiment with them in the Xanindo. The lack of vegetation in the canyon greatly reduced the odds of setting off cataclysmic forest fires for when the orbs inevitably backfire. Between preparations to march north into the kingdom, Hubert and Sylvain had been spending much of their spare time refining the portable fire orbs they had been developing. After several trials with different types of arcane crystals and holding containers, as well as looking through some Morphisi research materials provided by Eileen, the 2 men believed they had finally discovered the correct balance of fire magic, arcane crystal, and receptacle that could form the prototype for the handheld fire orbs. The first 2 attempts had ended in failure, when the orbs fizzled and died mere seconds after being charged with fire magic. Sylvain had tried using a standard fire spell to power the crystals. The arcane crystal had glowed a promising crimson, shining like coals in a fire pit when charged with fire magic. But the orbs had done little more than emit a thin, pitiful puff of smoke before going cold in Hubert's hand. It was quickly deduced that stronger fire magic was needed to charge the orbs if they were to retain enough energy to be effective. That led to the next 3 attempts, which involved Sylvain casting Bulganone on the orb instead. The first try had resulted in the orb exploding the instant the pillar of flames hit the orb. Fortunately, both Sylvain and Hubert had been standing several yards away from the blast. A few stray shards had pelted them as they ducked their heads and took cover, but nothing that resulted in any injury. The second try, after securing another arcane crystal and new glass orb, this one crafted of reinforced glass that was threaded with magic-resistant enchantments, had not fared much better. The strong glass had worked too well. The fire magic had been unable to permeate the glass and charge the arcane crystal within, resulting in Sylvain casting the spell over and over until the orb shattered from the repeated impact and left a burnt scorch on the rock it had been placed on. The third attempt had been promising. Sylvain's Bulganone spell was able to penetrate the glass orb without shattering it and sufficiently charge the arcane crystal until it blazed a pulsing volcanic orange. Hubert, wrapped in layers of protective gear, had tentatively picked up the orb and pressed at the glyphs that were etched into the glass, summoning a stream of flames that washed over the rocky terrain. The distance was nothing spectacular, only a few yards, but the orb's stability provided them with a suitable starting point from which they could further develop and fine-tune the device for combat purposes. An observation Hubert quickly rescinded, when the glowing ceased to dissipate once Hubert released the glyph, the arcane crystal cracking as the trapped fire magic swelled and erupted into an explosion that showered Hubert and the surrounding area with a hail of sparks and shattered glass. Hubert had growled as he scrambled to extinguish the small fire that had ignited on his sleeve. The next 15 minutes had been spent trying to pry fragments of sharp glass from his coat and mask, while scowling venomously at Sylvain, who had doubled over with laughter during the ordeal. Now it was the fourth attempt. The new orb, with slightly weaker protective enchantments, had been carefully crafted, a new arcane crystal inserted inside, a carefully calculated combination that would hopefully provide the durability needed to be a reliable conduit for fire magic. Gusts of wind whipped up clouds of the canyon's dusky sand and hurled it towards the two men as they prepared for the next orb test. Hubert wiped away the smears of rust-tinged dust that clumped onto the lenses of his mask with a muttered curse under his breath. Sylvain raised an arm to shield his face from the sandy wind, coughing at the mouthful of dry dust that slipped past his defenses. After a moment, the wind dissipated. Hubert nodded to Sylvain, the long beak of his mask dipping sharply downwards as he did so, to begin casting. Sylvain took a deep breath, aimed the arrow of Indra at the orb, and recited the incantation. Swirls of orange embers pulsed at the bladed tip and wound around the lance, weaving together a braid of sparkles and rippling flames. The fires coiling around the lance intensified. Flames and arcs pulsed down the weapon into searing waves as the incantation continued. Hubert turned to Sylvain sharply, his look of surprise concealed by his mask. As the paladin's words shifted, a new incantation sprang to life. The flames intensified into an inferno, near blinding, even from behind the tinted lenses. Instead of a Bolganone spell taking shape, the beginning threads of Ragnarok spooled together and wrapped around the shaft with sheets of magma, turning the lance into a molten arrow. "Sylvain!" Hubert called out with a muffled growl that was wrapped in suspicion and worry. Sylvain only nodded back at him with a wide grin that screamed, "Trust me!" as the flames surrounding his weapon burned brighter, a gesture that did absolutely nothing to alleviate the heavy lump of dread that settled in Hubert's stomach. With a grumbled sigh, Hubert took another step back, his arms already raised to brace himself for the inevitable explosion. Face furrowed with concentration, Sylvain steadied his shaking, fire-spun lance and yelled the last word of the incantation. Streams of flames sprung from the lance and descended upon the glass orb, swarming the small object in a blazing dome. Fissures cracked and splintered the rocky ground around the edge of the fiery dome as the hissing fires pulsed, building up to a crescendo that would ignite a blistering eruption. Hubert grit his teeth and watched as the flames of the Ragnarok spell surged to their final peak, knowing he would be plucking the mangled remains of the orb from his clothing once more in mere seconds. The explosion rattled the whole canyon. The ground shook from the blast's shock waves, the small quakes flickering across the rocky terrain like ripples, fluttering away from a stone into a pool of still water. More gusts of air slammed against him. Hubert threw an arm over his face to shield himself from their tearing claws, as a cascade of charred pebbles bounced harmlessly off his coat and mask. Squinting, he glanced to his left to notice Sylvain had ducked down in a similar defensive posture. Intense streamers of heat washed over them, not enough to damage, but singeing the air with choking, acrid scorches, a threatening taste of the Ragnarok spell's devastating power. After a moment, the waves of heat died down and vanished. Hubert lowered his arm and wiped his coat with his gloved hands, scratching away the smears of dust the explosion had stirred up. Curiously, no prickles of embedded glass poked at the heavy fabric protecting his fingertips. The heavy coat appeared to be free of the sad remnants of yet another obliterated spear. Perhaps the fire orb had survived the blast. The hopeful lilt from not having to dig out any glass chunks from his clothing immediately died, as Hubert took sight of the burnt crater that marked the spot where the orb had been resting. Smoke rose from the charred hollow the billowing pillar of ash that cut through the clear blue sky. Hubert turned to Sylvain with his arms crossed, shooting the paladin a dark scowl from behind his mask. "You do realize that was the last of our orbs. We are unlikely to procure any more before we march north," Hubert huffed. "Was there a particular reason you chose to cast the crystal using Ragnarok instead of Bolganone? First of all, there is so much ash and crap in that crater, we don't know for sure that the orb blown to bits. You're not picking glass splinters out of your beak at the moment, right?" Sylvain snipped back, his brow furrowed with irritation. "And second of all, Bolganone erupts from the ground, which only means one side of the orb is getting blasted with fire magic. And," Hubert growled, growing impatient, he went to pinch the bridge of his nose, only for his fingers to poke at the beak of his mask. He dropped his hand, and shook his head with another aggravated huff. "Well," Sylvain started, hints of uncertainty clouding his earlier combative tone, "what if the issue isn't the glass orb, but the arcane crystal within?" "Go on." Hubert crossed his arms, and nodded at Sylvain with a sharp jut of his beak. "So, the Bolganone spell is only blasting the crystal from the underside, which means the charge is uneven, right?" Sylvain pointed out, pacing back and forth, his feet scraping along the rocks with every step. "What if that uneven charge is making the crystal unstable, and causing it to explode? Thus you switch to Ragnarok, which would surround the crystals evenly, and charge it from all sides." Hubert finished Sylvain's hypothesis. His eyes widened with surprise, and a sliver of awe slid into his words. "I must say, I am impressed. You raise a good point, though it will be a moot one if our orb is reduced to little more than fine dust. Come on, let's just look and see if you can find the damn thing," Sylvain pleaded. With a sigh, Hubert made his way towards the still smoldering heap of burnt rock, the faint hint of the noxious charcoal smell, noticeable even through the filters of Hubert's mask. Thick layers of ash pooled in the shallow crater like a patch of sickly shaded snow, the charred flakes fluttering slightly in the wind. Embers still flicked and glowed, eerie and piercing, staring at Hubert through the greyed debris like the hostile eyes of a predatory animal lurking in a dense patch of foliage. Hubert knelt down by the small crater, the heat seeping into his knees, even with the fire-resistant clothing. He rooted through the ashes, shifting through the flakes for an object that would not instantly crumble to dust under his touch. A few moments later, his hand closed around a spherical object. Hubert blinked in surprise, and lifted it from the pool of ashes. Resting in his palm, the surface still hot against his gloved hand, lay an intact fire orb. No cracks or dents were to be found across its surface, the glass smooth and unblemished. The arcane crystal within glowed a healthy orange, flickering with the fire magic contained within. Hubert dusted off the remaining smears of dust, still clinging to the glass surface, the flakes drifting away in the canyon breeze. He turned to Sylvain, the paladin watching him with a smug grin. "Well, well, well. Looks like Sylvain's dumb idea may not be so stupid after all." "Perhaps," Hubert smirked, the mirth in his voice holding a teeny quality from beneath the mask, as if the words were being echoed through the metal beak. "We'll see if the orb remains functional. Now stand back." Sylvain did as ordered, and shuffled back several paces. An eager smile stretched his face, the paladin nearly bouncing with excitement, as he watched Hubert raise his hand and prepare to test the orb. Hubert pressed the glyph etched in the glass. The orange glow of the crystal blazed to life. Almost immediately, a near-perfect stream of flames sprung from the orb and washed over the rocky ground in a fiery arch. Flames pooled on the ground at the base of the arch, flickering harmlessly against the rock and stone under its burning touch. After a few seconds, Hubert released the glyph. The flames vanished, and the orb's vibrancy diminished to original, muted orange. Grinning, Hubert touched the glyph again, applying firm pressure to the sigil and triggering the orb to build up power. The crystal pulsed as it charged with energy. Sparks danced and swirled inside the orb, a tiny cyclone of flames springing and humming within the sphere. Lifting his arm, Hubert aimed the orb at the boulder several yards away and released the glyph. A fireball surged to life and spiraled towards the boulder. The attack landed on the boulder with near perfection. The orb's light dimmed, its fires dormant once more. Hubert turned to Sylvain, A wide grin split the paladin's face, his whole body vibrating with anticipation. My. It seems we finally have a successful prototype. Hubert smiled, a touch of pride slipping into his tone. Sylvain jumped into the air and pumped his fist with a triumphant shout. Ha! I told you it would work! He cheered. He raced forward and swept Hubert into a tight hug, laughing with joy, lifting the mage off his feet and giving him a small spin. Hubert sputtered, feeling his ribs being crushed by his companion's enthusiastic hold, but he returned the embrace with equal fervor, laughing along with the paladin's infectious laughter. Quite impressive! Hubert smirked from behind his mask as he was set back down on the ground. I must say, I applaud your resourcefulness and quick thinking. You deduced the source of our dilemma concerning the malfunctioning fire orbs, and were able to come up with a suitable solution, a resolution that I myself had been unable to reach. Well, I wasn't certain the orb wouldn't explode. Plus, I wouldn't have figured it out if you hadn't taught me nearly everything I know about magic. Sylvain chuckled shyly as he scratched the back of his head. Your flattery, although well-intentioned, is not needed, and does a disservice to your talents. Your abilities in casting fire magic in particular have grown exponentially since we started working together, Hubert said warmly. I do not hand out compliments lightly, but I do believe you have the makings to be quite the talented spellcaster. The professor was right to suggest honing your magic talents. Speaking of fire magic, do you think I could actually learn to cast Meteor? I'm getting pretty good at Ragnarok after all. Sylvain grinned, parroting Matilda's earlier suggestion back at the cottage. You will have to seek Dorothea's assistance if you wish to learn that spell, Hubert chuckled. Though, given your aptitude for fire magic, I do not see why such a feat would be outside the realm of impossibility. Well, if we're on the topic of new spells I can learn, you have to teach me that dark spike spell of yours sometime. Hubert frowned at Sylvain's cheery request and hopeful smile. Dark magic is one of the most difficult forms of spellcraft to cast, and, as already discussed, contains many hazards not inherent to other branches of magic. It requires manipulating the most caustic elements of our environment, acids, poisons, rot, even death itself. It is not an endeavor to be taken lightly. Even a single misstep could be fatal. Right, because having a Bolganone spell potentially explode in my face is so much better for my health, Sylvain muttered with an eye roll. Look, I'll be fine. I'll even borrow your dorky Dark Bishop outfit so I don't end up choking on my asthma or getting my eyeballs melted out by mire or whatever other horrible crap can backfire on me. Besides, it's not like you wear that outfit anyway. And how do you propose that's supposed to work? You and I do not exactly share similar physiques. Hubert sighed as he gestured vaguely between the two of them. Hey, we're almost the same height, and that coat is nearly 5 sizes too big for you, Sylvain teased, elbowing Hubert playfully in the ribs. Come on, it's perfect. Dark Spikes is great for skewering enemy paladins. I'm on a horse on a battlefield and running into cavalry units all the time. You couldn't ask for a better match. Perhaps that can be a project for another time, Hubert said with a wry smile, though I cannot promise that the endeavor will be successful. Dark Spikes is a difficult spell to cast, even for those with an aptitude for dark magic. Such an undertaking will require countless hours of dedicated study and practice that may never bear fruit. Sounds like a yes to me, Sylvain grinned, draping a friendly arm over Hubert's shoulders. Looks like we got our next project. Hubert shook his head with a mirthful sigh as he squeezed out of the paladin's grasp. Well, you have become a skilled spellcaster. Of that there is no doubt. I do not believe there is much more knowledge that I can impart to you, though I must say I am not so certain that I taught you much that you wouldn't have been able to glean on your own. To say the magic lessons have been unconventional would be putting it lightly, more trial by fire and combat than formal tutelage on my part, Hubert said with a light chuckle. You kidding? Sylvain grinned. I've learned way more about magic hanging out with you than I did during the entirety of my time with the Kingdom or the Academy. Besides, if I wanted lessons that were conventional, I would have badgered Mercedes or Annette for help. I am not so certain conventional is the adjective I would use to describe any lessons involving Miss Dominique. I have heard more explosions originating from the classroom during her lessons than anywhere else in Garrigmock. Nevertheless, I am certain you will be successful at your upcoming Dark Knight examination. Hubert smiled at the other man with rare, genuine warmth. Thanks, Hubert. That means a lot, Sylvain smiled back. Well, I guess we better start making our way back to the monastery. The others will probably start wondering where we're at. With that, the two began clearing up their research materials and other belongings. Hubert stashed the now cooled-down fire orb in his coat pocket and began stuffing his experiment notes into his satchel. Nearby, Sylvain was wrestling with his own gear and tidying up the scattered remains of their research equipment. Just wait till we get this thing fine-tuned, Sylvain piped as he stuffed several books and scrolls back into his satchel. Giving everyone one of these orbs? Just imagine, we could flip entire strategies on their heads if everyone had the ability to cast fire magic. Gambits that were practically impossible before would be an absolute breeze now. Even the everyday practical uses would be endless, like a torch that could be stored in your pocket and relit at any moment, or being able to start a campfire with just the press of your thumb. A portable fire orb does certainly open up new realms of possibility in both combat and day-to-day life. Hubert agreed, latching the buckles of his satchel closed as the last of his notes were securely tucked away. There still remains a long road ahead before they can be reproduced to any substantial degree, and further testing will be needed to determine their reliability. But I do believe what we achieved here today is something quite remarkable. The last of their supplies were tucked away and waked their way back to Garrick Mock. Hubert froze mid-step. Something, of movement, a sound, an irregularity of some sort caught his attention. He could not describe what exactly had set him on alert, but he had battled in the shadows long enough to trust his instincts when they started ringing alarm bells. His head swiveled from side to side, like an owl peering into the night foliage in search of its target. Nothing but rock, dust, and woolly shrubs greeted his eyes, barren and silent. The canyon remained as desolate as always. Sylvain turned to him, with a raised eyebrow as he finished strapping the arrow of Indra to his back. "You okay?" He frowned. Hubert frowned, and remained silent. Cursing, he ripped off his mask, blinking at the bright sunlight slamming against his vision. His eyes darted between every rock and boulder, narrowed at the shadows they cast. His ears were perked for the sound of footsteps against rock, the trickling rustle of a loose pebble bouncing upon the ground. Everything was silent and still. Not a trace of movement, nor the presence of another could be detected in the desolate canyon. Not even the wispy trails of another's magic could be sensed seeping through the air. Hubert pursed his lips into a thin line. It was possible that he had only imagined something out of the ordinary, a trick of the light, or perhaps the wind washing over a stray pebble and sending the tiny stone bouncing along the rocky terrain. Or perhaps they were being followed by someone remarkably skilled at covering their tracks. Hubert turned sharply to his companion. "Sylvain, be on your guard. I do not think we are alone." A pool of energy slammed into Hubert's back, making him stagger. The mask slipped from his hand and clattered to the ground. He dropped to his knees, blinking away a sudden onset lethargy that oozed through every nerve like molasses. Fatigue settled into his bones and dragged down his eyelids. The urge to lay down and close his eyes, as his body and mind drifted to the realm of dreams, pulled at every thought and muscle like ship anchors. Hubert grit his teeth and shook his head. A sleep spell. He fell forward with a tired grunt, his hands braced and struggling to hold him upright. Black spots rapidly warmed his vision like clouds of dark locusts. Static buzzed in his ears. Hubert thought he could hear Sylvain's voice through the shroud of sludge dousing his consciousness. Moving his mouth, trying to shout a warning to Sylvain, exhausted his last threads of energy. Even so, he was unable to utter more than an incoherent, babbling moan. Another blast hit him, another dose of sleep magic sinking into his core and dragging him to oblivion. Hubert collapsed onto his stomach with a weak groan. The last thing Hubert saw as his vision faded into black swirls of darkness was a set of armored feet approaching him. "Everything plan scouts say we're here. Alright. Everyone, position." Murmured voices drifted through the air, the sounds muffled as if the speakers were underwater. The noises worked their way past the syrupy goo of Hubert's consciousness and slithered into his brain, and the last vestiges of sleep began to fade. Hubert groaned, Fatigue still shackled his limbs, reducing his muscles to dull, aching muck, but he could feel his senses slowly sharpening and returning to life. He blinked. Dark, hazy swirls swam across his eyes as his brain tried to untangle the incoherent sludge clouding his vision. Rocky ground poked at his stomach and chest, and cold rock bit at the side of his cheek. The dank stench of stagnant water and moss tickled his nostrils. A cave? Hubert squirmed, trying to push himself into a seated position, only to find his range of motion greatly restricted. His wrists tied securely behind his back, and similar bindings had been woven around his ankles, trapping his legs together. He remained clothed in the bulky layers of the dark bishop coat, further weighing him down and trapping him in place. He could feel the spherical shape of the fire orb prototype still resting in his pocket. Whoever had captured him had clearly not done their due diligence by checking him for weapons. If he could just reach it. The voices continued to murmur over top of him. The words were unclear, but Hubert could make out at least 3 different speakers based on the cadence of tone of their words. A pebble bounced along the cave floor. A tiny rock shook loose by Hubert's shuffling. He winced, immediately stilling his movements, and pretending to be asleep. The tiny clicks of the pebble bouncing along the rocky floor sounded like thunderbolts in the small cave. The voices went silent. Even with his mind clouded with magic-induced drowsiness, Hubert could feel their eyes on him.
"He awakes at last! Soon our grand performance will come to life! A show of bravery, devotion, and true love that will be the envy of Envar's most famous operas!"
Peaked a shrill and painfully familiar voice, followed by a shrieking cackle that grated against Hubert's bones. There was only one person aggravating enough in all of Fodland that the voice could have belonged to. The last remnants of blurriness cleared. The congealed swirl of gaudy pinks and blues, dimmed by the cave's shadows, sharpened into focus, confirming to Hubert that none other than Constance von Nouvelle stood over him. The Grimly clapped her hands together with unrestrained glee.
"Worry not, for you are our guest of honor. Soon a hero most gallant and noble shall arrive and perform the most daring of rescues. A gesture of utmost devotion, uniting 2 star-crossed lovers at last," Constance declared with grandiose fervor, as if announcing the opening act of an opera to a crowded theater instead of the babble of a handful of people in the corner of a damp, mildew-encrusted cave. Hubert tried to growl something in response, but could not manage more than a muffled grunt. He did not have the faintest idea as to what Constance was rambling about, nor why the Ashen Wolves would take him hostage. The wolves had been early allies to Lady Edelgard's cause, making their sudden betrayal absolutely mystifying. True, Hubert thought Constance and Balthus were a pair of bombastic half-wits who were about as useful as an inebriated squirrel. However, he held a professional respect for Yuri, and considered himself on friendly terms with Happy. His eyes scanned the surroundings. The room he was kept in was dark, and composed entirely of rock. Floors, walls, ceiling, everything was stone. A handful of crates, and a derelict table and assortments of battered wooden chairs were the only furnishings to be seen. A repurposed cave, one of the Ashen Wolves' hideouts to be sure. A set of heavy double-door gates barred the only egress from the room. Hubert wiggled in his bindings, hoping his squirming would loosen the ropes enough for him to slip free, but to no avail. Normally, he would have little difficulty escaping from being tied up in such a manner, but whoever had knotted the ropes, coiled around his wrists and ankles, had been an expert. Yuri, most likely, if Hubert's hypothesis about being ambushed by the wolves turned out to be accurate. A loud crunch of someone biting into an apple and chewing loudly echoed sharply behind him. Sluggishly, Hubert turned his head and blinked, spotting Happy leaning against one of the cave walls and munching on an apple. "Hey, Bert," she greeted him in a casual tone, as if Hubert were merely passing her in the monastery hallways and not currently tied up and lying on the floor of what happened to be a repurposed cave. Hubert tried to speak again. His words quickly melted into a slurred groan, his mind still hazy from the lingering tendrils of the sleep spell that had hit him in the canyon. He pressed his face against the cold stone and squeezed his eyes shut as he waited for the final threads of drowsiness to fade. His thoughts remained a gnarled mess. The last thing he remembered was testing the latest fire orb prototype in the Red Canyon. The experiment had been a success, and he and Sylvain had just been preparing to leave. A jolt snapped through Hubert as he thought of the paladin. Sylvain had been by his side when the sleep spell had hit Hubert. He must have been captured as well. Unless... "Hey, Hubert, you feeling okay?" said the aforementioned paladin's voice in a friendly, casual tone. Hubert felt the paladin kneel at his side. Rage, volcanic and sharp, boiled through his blood and threatened to erupt as he turned to Sylvain and watched the other man's face slip into its usual, easygoing smile. "You!" Hubert roared at the Fargus knight, his mouth curled back in a vicious snarl, baring his teeth like a rabid animal at its captor. Someone he'd grown to see as a friend. Had Sylvain's loyalty to the Empire been a ruse all along? The magic lessons, the fire orb, helping Hubert sort out his feelings for Ferdinand, had it all been a lie? A carefully curated charade that allowed him to infiltrate the ranks of the Imperial army and gain the trust of the Empire's closest confidant? Was Hubert to be carted off, trussed up like a hog about to be roasted over fire, and handed to Dmitri, to be used as a hostage that could be leveraged against the Empire, or perhaps executed, as his decapitated head placed on a pike to serve as a warning? Hubert writhed and thrashed in his bonds, the ropes chafing against the tender skin at his wrists, but refusing to budge. He cursed himself for dropping his guard, believing he had made a friend. With his hands and ankles still tied together, Hubert crouched down and sprung at Sylvain like a rapid cobra, teeth snapping and itching to rend the traitor. Sylvain scrambled back and out of the mage's reach with a strangled yelp. Hubert flopped to the ground on his belly with a pained grunt. He lifted his head, baring his teeth and hissing at the alarmed knight. "Whoa, easy," Sylvain pleaded, laying on his back and his hands raised in a defensive position, a nervous smile on his face. "I know it looks bad, but I can explain." "Then I suggest you best start speaking this instant." Hubert's hiss was pure venom. Laying flat on his stomach, his eyes narrowed at his target looming over him, his lips curled back into a snarl. A mire spell sat on the tip of his tongue. The accuracy would be dubious with his hands tied behind his back, and unable to guide the trajectory of his casting, but melting the treacherous paladin and his accomplices would be manageable enough in such a confined space. Hubert wiggled on the ground like a worm impaled on a fishing hook, slowly contorting himself into an awkward seated position. Sylvain reached out a hand, as if to help him back up, but quickly retracted the limb back when Hubert snapped his teeth again. The paladin backed away with a heavy gulp. "So, here's the thing," Sylvain ventured cautiously, scratching at the back of his head and forcing a nervous chuckle. "Remember back in Baramas, where the two of us were cornered by those robed freaks and one of them came at you with a creststone? Then Ferdinand came tearing out the damn sky like a swooping hawk and ripped through those bastards? Well, the look on both your faces... Shit, if I didn't know the two of you were already mooning over each other. The starry-eyed gazes you kept sending back and forth sure as hell spelled it out then. Is there a point you're getting at? Because right now I fail to see the connection between Ferdinand's timely rescue in Baramas and why I'm currently tied up in the bowels of some dank, void-forsaken cave after clearly being struck with a sleep spell back at the canyon." Hubert growled in a tone lathered with menace and ice. He twitched his hands and feet, hoping he had managed to work the ropes loose enough to slip free and strangle Sylvain with his own 2 hands. The binding stubbornly held. "Well, I thought we could recreate that little daring rescue, reignite some of those sparks from Baramas." An eager, fox-like grin split Sylvain's face. "So I got Yuri and the other wolves to help me out and kidnap you. We tied you up and brought you here. Then we sent a letter to Ferdinand pretending to be some nasty bandits holding you hostage. Golden Boy will come tearing over here to rescue you like a shining knight from a fairy tale. The two of you will finally admit your damn feelings for each other, and everyone lives happily ever after. It's perfect." Hubert balked at the paladin's words. "A fake kidnapping? I told him it was a dumb idea." Happy shrugged as she took another bite of her apple. Hubert glared at his 3 captors, his mouth opening and closing several times, struggling to string together the words needed to vocalize the utter ridiculousness of the whole situation. "Have the remainder of your brain cells been turned to absolute sludge?" Hubert nearly screamed, his voice shrill and incredulous. "Charade or no, what you have just committed is tantamount to treason. Furthermore,
We are on the verge of marching into enemy territory, and you are wasting precious time with this idiot debacle. It was now or never. Void knows what will happen to any of us when we enter the kingdom. Look, it's going to be done in a few minutes. Ferdinand's already here. And don't worry, we're obviously not going to hurt you or Ferdinand, Sylvain assured him. Yuri, Balthus, and a few others are going to meet Ferdinand at the entrance of the base, put on a big show, and act like a bunch of unruly thugs. They'll retreat after a few hits, and then Ferdinand will find you here, where you'll be rescued. Ferdinand will be so relieved to see you that he'll confess his undying love. You'll admit that you have feelings for him too, and the rest of us will be all on our merry way while you two lovebirds enjoy some private time together as you celebrate becoming an official couple. Heat seared across Hubert's face, and his heart threatened to burst from his chest like a ruptured dam. Once again, Hubert stared wide-eyed and open-mouthed at his trio of captors, his words strangled with disbelief, unable to articulate the sheer lunacy of what he had just heard proposed to him. Ever since Ludwig von Eyer's demise, Hubert had kept a close watch over Ferdinand, but dared not even consider bringing up the possibility of pursuing a romantic relationship with the man, not in Ferdinand's current, raw emotional state. Grief and rage warring in the paladin's mind, as he processed everything that had transpired with the former Duke of Eyre. What Ferdinand needed was time to heal. Unsurprisingly, Ferdinand had thrown himself into his duties to the imperial army in the wake of his father's death. He had always been industrious, always eager to prove himself by taking on task loads that were intended to be handled by multiple people, but the last several days had filled him with an almost frantic energy, as if he would cease to be if he remained still for a moment. The cheery smile still remained plastered on his face. A ray of light refused to be snuffed out, but Hubert could see the fissures in the joyous facade, the even sheen of dullness that watched over his amber eyes, and the dark circles ringed around. Even his hair seemed to have lost some of its luster, appearing more like worn rust than fiery copper. A sharp blade had cut at Hubert's chest, at the sight of Ferdinand's haggard appearance, as the Holy Knight drifted from task to task with strangled cheer. On multiple occasions, Hubert had sent agents with missives to be brought to Ferdinand, ordering him to sleep. Ferdinand would respond to the messages with friendly assurances that were rarely met. Hubert had done what he could to redirect the mountain loads Ferdinand insisted on carrying upon his shoulders, assigning extra people to assist him with stable duties, ensuring others were maintaining the army's weapons and equipment, recruiting other officers to substitute for Ferdinand's teaching duties. That said, no matter how many duties Hubert delegated out of the Holy Knight's reach, Ferdinand always seemed to unearth something more. Among the many tasks Ferdinand had been attacking with frenzied intensity was his training. Although hardly one to skirt combat practice in the past, the paladin practically lived in the training ground the last couple days. Though would barely have risen in the morning sky, and Ferdinand could be found running laps in full heavy armor or hacking away an assortment of training dummies with an array of bladed weapons, until the paladin was sweat-drenched and staggering from exhaustion. During one such practice, Hubert had joined him in the training grounds while Ferdinand was practicing his spear work. A series of sharp jabs stabbed at the air. Ferdinand had pivoted with a dancer's finesse and swept the weapon up in a wide arc before gliding the spear through the air in a wide loop, spinning about and bringing the glittering blade to the ground with a roaring battle cry. Hubert watched the demonstration with awe, mesmerized by Ferdinand's swift, agile movements. Another quick pivot had Ferdinand twisting around and thrusting the spear towards Hubert, the blade halting less than a yard from where the mage stood. "Hubert!" Ferdinand had widened with alarm and retracted the spear. "I do wish you would not sneak up on me in such a way. I would hate for my blade to accidentally strike you." "I suppose it would be rather unfortunate for you to skewer me in the middle of the training grounds," Hubert had chuckled. Unfortunately, Petra had also been practicing in the training grounds that morning, and had been within earshot of the exchange. She turned to the two men with a bright grin, and mirth sparkling in her eyes as she hollered at them, "But Hubert, have you not been having the hope that Ferdinand will be skewering you?" Petra had giggled at the two men. "Then you would be having much enjoyment with receiving his lance thrusts." Hubert had felt his face burn into an inferno of scarlet, and the unintended double entendre behind his initial comment had clicked into place. And based on the equally crimson patches blooming across Ferdinand's own face, the realization had quickly sunk into the other man as well. Both had quickly departed the training grounds, with awkward stammers, as Petra continued to snicker at them. Between Dorothea's body sense of humor, Aloise's compulsive need to spout every pun that came to mind, it was little wonder that Petra had been cackling over them for the double meaning of lances and thrusts. On the bright side, Petra's teasing had coaxed Ferdinand to temporarily putting aside his duties to join Hubert in the mess hall for some breakfast. In the cave, Hubert glowered at Sylvain's grinning, idiotic face. Hubert did not think it was possible for the Fargus Knight to come up with an idea worse than the nude drawing suggestion, but somehow Sylvain had managed to surprise him once again. "And what is your plan to be if this farce ends up bringing an entire battalion of Her Majesty's soldiers to this hideout?" Hubert spat as he dragged himself back up to a kneeling position. "The abduction of an imperial general is not a matter to be taken lightly. I guarantee you that such an offense will be met with swift retribution." "Well, the note made it very clear Ferdinand was to come alone," Sylvain shrugged. "And you know how he is. There's no way he'd put risking your life in danger by alerting Edelgard and the others. You complete and utter imbecile. Hey, you'll be thanking me when Ferdinand sweeps you off your feet for a victory smooch." Hubert grumbled under his breath and slumped into his bindings with an angry huff. In the distance, Hubert could hear the shouts of soldiers being attacked, followed by the clang of steel and the clash of wood being reduced to splinters. "Looks like your knight in shining armor's going to be here soon." Sylvain grinned and placed a friendly hand on Hubert's shoulder. "Just hang tight for a few minutes." Hubert squirmed out of Sylvain's grasp and glared up at the other man. "Rest assured that we will be speaking about your questionable decision-making once this fiasco is done with," Hubert growled. Sylvain winced, gulping at the mage's hostile glare. "All right, fine, but I really think this'll work," Sylvain said with a hopeful smile as he turned his gaze back to the doors. Hubert fidgeted in his minds and ground his teeth. His knees ached as the cold stone seeped into his leg muscles. The screeches and crashes roared and raged, growing louder and louder as the battle drew near. If Hubert had not been informed otherwise, he would have thought Yuri and the others were engaging with an entire battalion. Hurried footsteps echoed towards them, followed by someone frantically hammering at the gates, barring the room. "Open up!" Yuri's voice barked from the other side. A loud, creaking groan of heavy-aged wood and hinges grinding together ripped through the air as the large set of double doors were pried open. Yuri and Balthus burst inside and slammed the barriers shut behind them. Both were garbed in heavy cloaks to disguise their appearances. Balthus leaned with his back against the gate, panting. Beyond the closed door, a chorus of panicked shouts and the screech of metal clashing with metal echoed through the caves. Yuri stood next to Balthus, doubled over with his hands on his knees, gasping for air. The mockingbird's usually well-kept hair was a chaotic nest of dirt-encrusted purple strands. A large scratch ran the length of his cheek, and his chest heaved as he dragged in ragged gulps of air. Caustic eyes flicked in Sylvain's direction. He clenched his hands, gnashed his teeth, and stormed towards the small group clustered around Hubert. "We need to abort this plan. Now!" Yuri shouted at Sylvain. "Why? Everything's going perfectly. What's the problem?" Sylvain frowned. Another crash, this one sounding suspiciously like a warhammer smashing through an iron shield, tore and ricocheted through the air like an eagle's screech. "Oh, nothing at all, except for the fact that Ferdinand Vineyer is going to kill us all!" Yuri screamed at the paladin. "Colton boy? Really?" Sylvain laughed. "Come on, it can't be that bad. You have fought alongside Ferdinand countless times, seen his deadly combat prowess firsthand, yet you doubt he has the ability to cleave through every one of your clownish buffoons, as if you were little more than crumpled balls of dried parchment?" Hubert shouted. Sylvain ignored Hubert's comment and made his way to the gates. He peered through the small gap in the doors, his eyes widening and jaw gaping open. Well, shit. With his hands and ankles still tied, Hubert shuffled into a crouching position and clumsily hopped towards the heavy set of double doors where the others were gathered, peeking through the cracks in the aged wood and gazing at the awe-inspiring scene on the other side. Ferdinand roared and tore through the caravans in a whirlwind of righteous fury. Hair of copper flew around him in waves of fire as Ferdinand roared at his opponents. Even from a distance, Hubert could see the Holy Knight's amber eyes blaze like embers as he rushed his next target with startling speed. The warhammer clutched in his hands, looped into a high arch, was brought down with a thunderous crash against the great shields held by the 2 fortress knights he was engaging. The frightened guards threw down their mangled shields and weapons and scampered away in the opposite directions. Warmth filled Hubert's core, and bolts of lightning danced along his nerves as his eyes drank in Ferdinand's magnificent presence. What stood on the other side of the gates was no mere man, but a deity of war and wrath. Truly, a marvel on the battlefield, a sight of unmatched strength and power. All the bards and minstrels in all of Fodlan could spin epics singing of Ferdinand's many glories, and they would not even come close to scratching the surface of his true radiance. Hubert breathed, his voice rasping with an unusual husky timbre. "Look, I'm glad to see this is doing it for you, and I'm sure you can explore this new discovery sometime in the future, but we're about to die." Sylvain gulped as he dragged Hubert away from the shuddering doors. The gates swelled inward, the flimsy shield of wood barely containing the surging tidal wave raging on the other side. An animalistic roar boomed from the other side. Hubert swallowed heavily at the noise. More heat and sparks coursed through his body. "No one's home!" Balthus wailed, his back pressed against the doors as he struggled to hold them closed. The gates rattled, as if hammered by a herd of bulls, the aged wood nearly splintering under the force of the Holy Knight's attacks. Emerald glowed between the door cracks, and the crest of Kehoe flared to life. "Where is Hubert?" Ferdinand's enraged voice bellowed from the other side of the doors. "Mark my words, if you so much as harm a single hair on his head, there will be no corner in all of Fodlan for you to hide." Warmth flooded Hubert's chest and crawled up his neck, blooming across his face in searing patches of crimson. His breath hitched in his throat. The possessive roar sent more crackling tingles racing through Hubert's body. A trickle of dust fell from the ceiling and landed on Hubert's face. He sputtered, spitting out the chunk of dirt and blinking the particles from his eyes. More streams of dust cascaded down from overhead, shaken loose by Ferdinand's infuriated barrage. His eyes flickered anxiously around the room, unease gurgling in his stomach as he questioned the structural integrity of the hideout. "End this farce now and open the doors before he brings down the entire cave system on our heads!" Hubert snapped at Sylvain and Yuri. The 2 men, staring pale and uneasy at the quaking doors, hastily nodded and opened the gates. Ferdinand tore through the second the doors opened, his warhammer raised, and his face twisted in a ferocious snarl. He froze, blinked rapidly, and lowered his hammer as he took in the scene of Hubert tied up and kneeling by Sylvain and the ashen wolves. Confusion clashed with the fiery rage that had swarmed his face. "Hey, Ferdinand," Sylvain waved to the Holy Knight with an awkward smile. "It's all good. Hubert's not in danger and everything's fine. You can put down the warhammer." Ferdinand lowered the hammer, but did not release it. "Hubert? Sylvain? I do not understand. What is going on?" Ferdinand's voice cracked and faltered. His worried gaze, blazing with fury seconds earlier, darted between the cavern's occupants, his face crinkling with glowing distress. "So, here's the thing," Sylvain began with an awkward chuckle. "This is going to sound crazy, but we were trying to recreate how you rescued him back in Baromus. You came diving out of the sky like a Sotha's damned archangel, tearing through robed freaks like you were wrath incarnate. Then you went to check on Hubert, and you looked so worried and enamored, so we staged a whole kidnapping to— What? Why would— Ferdinand gasped, the noise coming out more as a sob. Amber eyes blinked furiously, fighting back the cascade of tears that were pooling in his eyes. His eyes darted between Sylvain and Hubert. Anger bloomed across his face, and his lips pulled back into a snarl. "Was this all some sort of sick joke to you?" A cold lance speared Hubert's core at the hostile words and infuriated look Ferdinand was shooting him. He stammered, hastily trying to explain himself. "Ferdinand, Ferdinand whirled on Hubert, the rage on his face turning molten. "You knew I had feelings for you, and you made a game out of it!" The revelation slammed into Hubert like a typhoon. Ferdinand had feelings for him. Just like that, every hope and dream Hubert had carried about them transcending the bonds of friendship and becoming something more had been confirmed and laid bare with that snarled handful of words. It was obvious, had been for a while. Deep down,
Hubert had known Ferdinand had cared for him some time. The clues were incalculable. How Ferdinand had treated him during their date in the Ogma Mountains, his reaction to Hubert's dancing, the way he had opened up to Hubert about his worries over his mother, the yarrow he had given Hubert back at the cottage, even the gifts they had exchanged, long before Sylvain had began his meddling in Hubert's romantic affairs. A toddler could have pieced together Ferdinand's romantic interest in the mage, but Hubert's mind had been so mired in denial, he did not dare consider the possibility that someone as bright and wonderful as Ferdinand would ever harbor feelings for a grim shadow like Hubert. Hubert had imagined that Ferdinand admitting his feelings would be a dream come true, pure joy that would fill Hubert's chest with warm rays of sunlight. Instead, the revelation screamed at him with a rageful sob, had doused Hubert's chest with a hail of ice, to see his deepest desire and hope confirmed, only to crumble into dust the second it coiled into reality. Hubert tried to speak, apologize for Sylvain's foolhardy idea, assure Ferdinand his feelings of love were returned, and had been for some time, to say something, anything. No words would take shape. His throat had seized like a rusted hinge. Hubert's mouth opened and shut, pathetically like a fish washed ashore. A broken huff of laughter rasped from Ferdinand's throat, the sound cutting deeper than any blade. "Well, I hope you have found my humiliation entertaining." Ferdinand spat bitterly. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and trickled drop by drop onto the cave floor. "Wait!" Sylvain sputtered. "This isn't—" "Ferdinand," Hubert pleaded, the words threaded with more desperation than he had ever heard in his own voice. "That's not what—" "No," Ferdinand growled, a sob hitching his breath, his eyes glaring at Hubert and Sylvain. "I have heard enough from both of you." The warhammer fell to the ground with a loud clatter, the drop of the weapon feeling like an executioner's blade cutting through Hubert's neck. Ferdinand took off through the caves, tiny, hitched sobs following his echoing footsteps. Sylvain stood between Hubert and the door, his hands pulling frantically in his own hair. He looked down at Hubert with a sorrowful gaze. "Shit. This wasn't how it was supposed to—" "Hubert, I'm sorry." "You have done more than enough," Hubert snarled, the ice in his chest melting into volcanic fury as he snapped at the paladin. "I should never have agreed to your moronic, asinine agreement. And to think, for a moment, I had actually thought you were someone of intelligence, Gautier. I was a fool to consider you would be anything other than the same blundering half-wit who only joined our class on a senseless whim to spend more time with the professor. If I never have to see your miserable face again, it will be too soon. Leave my sight at once." Sylvain took a half-step back, flinching away from the mage's hostile words. I'm sorry," he stammered. He swallowed heavily, his eyes jumping between Hubert and the open set of gates Ferdinand had passed through moments earlier. Sorrow shifted to determination as an idea appeared to click together in his mind. I can fix this." Sylvain nodded rapidly, his body shaking and his words panicked. "I can fix this. Just hold on." With that, Sylvain sprinted through the gates and charged after Ferdinand, his boots clanking and echoing along the stone floors. Moments later, Hubert could hear the sound of Ferdinand and Sylvain's muffled arguing, moving further away. Hubert twisted and tried to wrench his arms free from his bonds. The ropes held tight, refusing to budge. "Get me out of this!" Hubert barked at Yuri, who, along with the rest of the wolves, had been watching the whole scene unfold with stunned silence. Yuri blinked as if startled, then moved to untie the knotted ropes at Hubert's wrists and ankles. "Sorry about all this. I told Sylvain it was a bad idea." Yuri sighed, as the last of the ropes fell loose, freeing Hubert's limbs. Hubert rubbed his sore wrists and growled at the mockingbird. He made a mental note to ensure Yuri's next covert assignment was something decidedly unpleasant. Perhaps something involving trudging through Deirdre's sprawling system of cisterns. He scrambled to his feet, muscles numb and tingling, as if poked by a hail of sewing needles, and took off through the open gates after the two paladins. He sprinted through the network of caverns, flying over the debris of splintered barricades and shields,
Chunks of broken wood and shattered metal littered the floor, the remnants of the wolves' attempt to keep Ferdinand's wrath at bay. Had circumstances been different, Hubert would have admired seeing evidence of Ferdinand's unstoppable strength on the battlefield. He clenched his teeth, mind spinning and chest aching. His heart clenched and throbbed, claws digging into the beating organ, threatening to wrench it from his ribcage. Things with Ferdinand were not going to end like this, not after everything they had been through. After finally hearing it from Ferdinand's own lips that he harbored feelings for him, a confirmation of Hubert's deepest desires, something buried away, locked tight within the closely guarded vault of his mind. A possibility he dare not even dream to consider. Light glowed at the far end of the cavern. The voices were closer, but their words still indistinguishable. Hubert took a deep breath and added a burst of speed to his hasty steps. He rounded the last corner and spotted the two paladins standing at the entrance, their armored forms silhouetted by the golden glow of the setting sun. Arms waved around to the cadence of raised voices, both men locked in a verbal duel, Ferdinand still fuming with barely contained anger, Sylvain raising his hands defensively and speaking to his comrade in a placating manner. "The two of you have been sneaking off and plotting together for months. Did you even need magic lessons, or was that a fabrication as well? Another part of your demented plan to make me look like a fool? Look, Hubert had nothing to do with this. I swear it was all my dumb idea." Hubert had reached the entrance to the caves, was about to call out to Ferdinand, when everything went wrong. It happened so quickly, Hubert later replayed the moment again and again, the horrifying scene branded into every corner of his mind. One moment, the two paladins were arguing, their gazes flickering to Hubert as they heard the mage approach. The next, half a dozen robed figures materialized around the two knights, nightmarish wraiths spun into existence. Hubert barely had time to shout a warning to the two men when both Ferdinand and Sylvain found themselves restrained by Thalus's loathsome acolytes. With an enraged snarl, a miasma spell spun to life in Hubert's palm. Unfortunately, the wretches had already conjured magic of their own and fired it directly at Hubert. There was no time to block or dodge the attack. The miasma spell hit Hubert square in the chest and threw him backwards, his back slamming against the cave wall. Hubert slumped to the ground, coughing. The dark bishop robes had absorbed the brunt of the damage, but the impact was enough to knock the wind out of his lungs. Hubert coughed, his vision dazed. His arms shook, brittle like aged twigs, as he struggled to push himself back to his feet. He screamed another incantation, miasma twirling in his palm as a tiny hurricane of toxic fumes and launched at the maggots who dared put their hands on the two paladins. But it was too late. In a cloud of red mist, the dark mages warped away with the paladins. The miasma spell struck the opposite wall and fizzled away in a harmless puff of purpling gas. Hubert blinked. The cave entrance was empty, as if the two paladins had never been there. Ice lanced through his chest. Every breath, rapid and shaky, poured into his lungs like rusted nails soaked in vinegar. It felt as if an axe had been clawed through Hubert's rib cage, rendering the beating organ within to pieces. Hubert scrambled to his feet and searched the surrounding area, for the off chance the battle had brought Ferdinand and Sylvain away from the cave entrance while Hubert had been stunned, that the two paladins were merely recovering from combat and would greet Hubert with relieved smiles. There was nothing. Not a single other soul could be found in the area. Hubert dropped to his knees. Stinging droplets burned at his eyes, and serrated gulps of air shredded his lungs. He clenched his fist and hammered the ground with a helpless scream. It was no use. Ferdinand and Sylvain were gone.